There is a common misconception that Walter White is the undisputed genius of the operation. We look at the chemistry, the formulas, and the calculated maneuvering, and we assume he is always the smartest person in the room. Yet, if you actually pay attention to the survival of these characters, there are so many times that Walt should have been caught, eliminated, or completely ruined by his own massive ego. And in those critical moments, it wasn't the master chemist who found a way out, it was the dropout. Today we are breaking down every single time Jesse Pinkman was actually smarter than Walter White, starting with the realization that book smarts rarely translate to survival in the underworld. If you think Heisenberg was the one pulling all the strings, you might want to look closer at who was actually cutting them. When we look back at the earlier days, specifically the stranded excursion in the desert during the 4 Days Out episode, we see the perfect microcosm of their dynamic. Walt is the one with the scientific knowledge, the one who understands the elemental composition of the batteries and the chemical reactions needed to get them home. But notice his state of mind. Walt is defeated. He is resigning himself to his fate, practically writing his own obituary in his head, consumed by the impossibility of the situation. He sees the complex problem and lets it paralyze him. Jesse, on the other hand, does not have the burden of knowing exactly how impossible the physics are. He just knows they need to survive. While Walt is spiraling into a panic attack and coughing up blood, Jesse is the one proposing solutions. Sure, his initial ideas about robots or dune buggies are not scientifically sound, but his mindset is problem-solving oriented, while Walt's is problem-fixated. It is Jesse who eventually asks the fundamental question about the lab's power source that sparks the light bulb in Walt's head. Without Jesse's relentless, albeit uneducated, drive to find a practical solution, the great Heisenberg would have dehydrated right there in the sand, a victim of his own resignation. This establishes a pattern that repeats throughout the entire series. Walt overthinks, panics, and lets his pride blind him, while Jesse cuts through the noise with a simple, often overlooked truth. Take the infamous fly incident in the underground lab. This is often cited as a bottle episode, but it is actually the definitive proof that Jesse is the emotionally superior operator. Walt is losing his mind. He is sleep-deprived, paranoid, and obsessed with a single contaminant that, in the grand scheme of their industrial-scale production, is statistically insignificant. He is willing to shut down the entire operation, miss their quota, and anger the most dangerous man in the Southwest over a housefly. This isn't genius. This is a breakdown. Walt is on the verge of confessing everything about Jane, a slip-up that would have ended their partnership and likely Jesse's life right then and there. Jesse recognizes the danger immediately. He doesn't care about the fly, he cares about managing Walt. He realizes that the only way to solve this problem isn't with a fly swatter, but by managing his partner's deteriorating mental state. Jesse takes control. He drugs Walt, not to hurt him, but to force him to sleep. He climbs the ladder, he humors the insanity, and he physically handles the labor that Walt is too frantic to execute. He protects the business from Walt's instability. If Jesse hadn't stepped up to be the adult in the room during that shift, Walt's erratic behavior would have signaled to Gus Fring much earlier that he was a liability. Jesse saved Walt from himself, and he did it with a level of emotional intelligence that Walt never possessed. But it goes beyond just managing Walt's moods. We have to talk about street politics. There is this recurring theme where Walt tries to apply logic to a world that runs on reputation and fear, and he fails miserably until he adopts a chaotic persona. But Jesse understands the cause and effect of the street intuitively. Think about the expansion of their territory. Walt sees dollar signs. He calculates the potential profit of moving into new corners and expanding the distribution network. To him, it is just math. More territory equals more volume equals more money. He treats the cartel's turf like a risk-free board game. Jesse, however, knows the human cost. He understands that moving into someone else's spot means violence is inevitable. He hesitates not because he is weak, as Walt often implies, but because he is smart enough to know they aren't ready for a war. When the tragedy with Combo happens, it is a direct result of Walt's aggressive expansion strategy. Walt pushed for the move, ignoring the realities of the environment they were operating in. Jesse's apprehension was the smarter, more survival-focused instinct. Walt thought he could outsmart the cartel structure. Jesse knew you had to respect it or be crushed by it. And this brings us to one of the most significant pivots in the show, where Jesse's intuition completely outclasses Walt's manipulation. We all remember the end of Season 4, the master plan to take down Gus. But before that, there is a long stretch where Walt is convinced that Gus is grooming Jesse to replace him. Walt spins this narrative that Jesse is being played, that he is just a pawn. And while that might have been Gus's initial intention, something shifts that Walt is too jealous to see. Jesse actually proves himself to the cartel. When they are down in Mexico and the chemists are mocking Jesse for his lack of formal education, for his inability to synthesize the compound using their sophisticated terminology, Walt would have tried to debate them. He would have tried to prove he was smarter. Jesse does something brilliant. He asserts dominance not through chemistry, but through purity. He calls them out on their dirty equipment and their lack of standards. He channels the arrogance of Heisenberg, but backs it up with the practical skills he learned. He earns the respect of the cartel on his own merits. Walt is back in New Mexico, fuming, convinced Jesse is incompetent and in danger, while Jesse is single-handedly securing their safety by making himself indispensable. Walt thinks he is the only one who matters to the operation, but in that Mexican lab, Jesse proves that the student has surpassed the master in terms of adaptability. Walt needs perfect conditions to be a genius. Jesse can survive in the dirt. If Walt had been the one sent to Mexico without his usual equipment or his ego being stroked, he likely would have insulted the cartel leadership or refused to cook under subpar conditions, getting himself eliminated. Jesse's ability to read the room and adapt his status is a form of intelligence that saved his life repeatedly, while Walt's rigid ego constantly put them in the crosshairs. This dynamic of Walt creating a mess and Jesse having to navigate the emotional fallout sets the stage for everything that comes later. And if you think the magnetic wipe of the evidence room was the peak of Jesse's ideas, you are forgetting the subtle moments where he saw through the lies that everyone else bought into. But before we get to the magnet and the train heist, we have to look at how Jesse handled the investigation itself. While Walt was driving into oncoming traffic, metaphorically and literally, to keep secrets, Jesse was often the one holding the keys to their freedom. If you are enjoying this breakdown of the hidden layers in the series, you might want to check out my previous video on only characters who actually won in the show, or the theory on what if Hank Schrader survived the desert. But right now, we need to talk about the moment Jesse Pinkman realized that Mr. White wasn't doing any of this for his family. There is perhaps no clearer example of the shift in their intellectual dynamic than the aftermath of the Superlab's destruction. At the start of the 5th season, the trio Walt, Jesse, and Mike face a catastrophic problem. The laptop containing the surveillance footage is locked inside a heavily fortified police evidence room. This is a situation where brute force is suicide, and doing nothing guarantees a life sentence. Watch how the two older, experienced men react. Mike, the seasoned veteran of the criminal underworld, immediately sees the situation as hopeless. His instinct is to cut losses and run, believing the heat is too great. Walt, on the other hand, spirals into a chaotic state of arrogance and panic. He starts proposing ideas that are loud, dangerous, and practically impossible, fixating on explosives or complex infiltrations that would almost certainly get them killed or caught. They are deadlocked in a power struggle, two massive egos crashing against each other, completely blind to the environment around them. It is Jesse who looks around the scrapyard they are hiding in and sees the answer. He doesn't get bogged down in the politics of who is in charge. He observes the surroundings, sees the heavy machinery, and connects the dots. He understands the fundamental principle that digital information is magnetic, and they are standing in a graveyard of giant magnets. While the genius chemist is overcomplicating the physics and the veteran enforcer is planning his escape, the dropout formulates a plan that destroys the evidence without anyone ever setting foot inside the police station. When Jesse proposes the magnet, notice Walt's reaction. He is stunned. It is a solution that uses scientific principles Walt's own domain, but applied with a street-smart practicality that Walt completely lacks. Walt can do the math to build the device, but he never would have conceived of the idea because he lacks that creative lateral thinking. Jesse saved the entire operation from immediate exposure, not because he knew more formulas, but because he was the only one calm enough to think clearly. This brilliance continues into what might be the most high-stakes heist of the entire series, the train robbery. The crew needs a massive amount of precursor to continue their cooks, and their only option is to steal it from a freight train. The logistics are a nightmare. They are dealing with thousands of gallons of fluid, a tight schedule, and a crew that is ready to use lethal force if necessary. Walt approaches this problem like a warlord. He is ready to do whatever it takes, likely involving violence or high-risk confrontation that would leave a trail of bodies and evidence. He sees the objective and ignores the collateral damage. But Jesse approaches it like a magician. He realizes that the best crime is one that nobody ever knows happened. It is Jesse who conceptualizes the fluid displacement theory. He figures out that if they replace the weight of the stolen chemical with the exact same weight of water, the scales at the destination will never tip, and the theft will go unnoticed for days or even weeks. This is a level of criminal sophistication that Walter White, for all his bluster about being the danger, simply does not possess. Walt is a hammer, Jesse is a scalpel. Walt's plan would have likely alerted the authorities immediately. Jesse's plan kept them in the shadows. It was elegant, scientific, and bloodless, at least until the very end, which was entirely out of Jesse's control. But Jesse's intelligence isn't limited to grand heists and magnets. We have to talk about his mastery of social engineering, specifically the incident at the house of the unpredictable duo Tucker and his friend. When Jesse goes to retrieve the stolen money, he enters a hostile environment. He is dealing with individuals who are paranoid, chemically altered, and armed. Walt would have walked in there with a gun and a demand. He would have tried to intimidate them, which, given their unstable state, would have likely resulted in a shootout. Walt relies on fear, but you cannot scare someone who is already out of their mind. Jesse knows this. He understands the psychology of the addict better than anyone. He doesn't pull a weapon, he grabs a shovel. He starts digging a hole in the front yard. He engages Tucker's obsessive fixation, manipulating his focus entirely onto the act of digging. It is a masterclass in psychological manipulation. By the time he enters the house, he has neutralized the threat without raising a voice or lifting a finger in anger. He walks past the danger, while Walt would have tried to blow it up. This moment proves that while Walt understands chemistry, Jesse understands people. He knows what motivates them, what distracts them, and how to maneuver around them. And this ability to read people is exactly why Jesse was the first one to truly understand the threat of Gus Fring. While Walt was convinced that he could negotiate with or outsmart the Chicken Man, Jesse felt the cold reality of who they were dealing with. There is a scene in the diner where Mike takes Jesse out for the day, and Walt is frantic, leaving desperate voicemails, convinced that Mike is going to take Jesse out to the desert and eliminate him. Walt projects his own fears onto the situation. He thinks because he is useless to Gus, Jesse must be too. But Jesse realizes something during those car rides. He realizes he is being assessed. He understands the utility of loyalty before Walt does. While Walt is busy trying to be the boss, Jesse is quietly becoming the guy the boss relies on. He makes himself essential not by demanding respect, but by demonstrating competence and stability traits that Walt was rapidly losing. It is ironic that the man Walt constantly belittled for his lack of application is the one who effectively secures their safety by building a bridge with Mike. Walt burns bridges, Jesse builds them. And in the criminal underworld, having a friend like Mike Ehrmantraut is infinitely more valuable than having a Nobel Prize-sized ego. Furthermore, we see Jesse's deductive reasoning sharpen as the series progresses, often outpacing Walt's ability to cover his tracks. The entire subplot involving the ricin cigarette is the ultimate testament to this. Walt gaslights Jesse into believing he lost it, spinning a complex web of lies to turn Jesse against Gus. And for a while, it works. But deep down, Jesse's intuition is screaming at him. When he finally puts the pieces together later on, it isn't because he found a smoking gun immediately. It is because his emotional memory is flawless. He remembers the bump. He remembers the sleight of hand. He processes the timeline and realizes that the only logical explanation is the one that betrays his trust. Walt relies on the idea that he can talk his way out of anything, that he can confuse Jesse with logic. But Jesse's gut instinct acts as a lie detector that Walt eventually cannot fool. Even in the earlier seasons, looking back at the 4 days out scenario, we see the seeds of this. When they are building the battery, Walt is the one explaining the science, but Jesse is the one who keeps Walt on task. Walt is ready to give up, to die in the desert, resigning himself to failure. Jesse's refusal to accept that intellectual defeat is what pushes them forward. He forces Walt to think. In many ways, Jesse is the catalyst for Heisenberg's survival. Without Jesse's push, Walter White is just a chemistry teacher who died of heat stroke in an RV. As we move toward the collapse of their empire, the disparity in their survival instincts becomes even more glaring. Walt believes he can control Jack and his gang. He thinks money and reputation are enough to keep wild dogs on a leash. Jesse knows better. He knows that once you let monsters into your house, you don't get to tell them when to leave. He fears Todd and his uncle not because he is cowardly, but because he assesses the threat level accurately. Walt thinks he is the king, but Jesse knows they are just prey waiting to be eaten. This survival instinct is what eventually leads Jesse to try and leave town with the vacuum repairman the first time. He recognizes the ship is sinking while Walt is still trying to rearrange the deck chairs. If Jesse had managed to leave then, if he hadn't realized the truth about the ricin in that moment, he would have escaped the hell that followed. His intelligence almost got him out. It was his loyalty and his need for justice that pulled him back in. And if you really analyze their final confrontation, you see that Jesse finally surpasses Walt completely. He holds the gun. He has the power. Walt, broken and bleeding, gives him the order to do it, trying one last time to manipulate Jesse into being his executioner, to give Walt the ending he wants. But Jesse sees the game. He refuses to be the tool anymore. He tells Walt to do it himself. In that refusal, Jesse proves he is no longer the student. He has broken the spell. He outsmarts Walt's final attempt at control by simply walking away. But before we get to that end, there is a specific sequence of events involving the bugs in the wire that really highlights how differently they operate under surveillance. While Walt is obsessed with finding the technology, tearing apart his own home, Jesse is watching the behavior of the people around them. He notices the shifts in attitude, the subtle glances. He is reading the room, while Walt is reading the manual. This difference in perception is critical. In the next part, we are going to break down exactly how Jesse Pinkman managed to survive slavery, outlast the great Heisenberg, and eventually secure the one thing Walt never could, a future. Because while Walt died surrounded by his precious equipment, Jesse drove into the night, scarred but alive, proving that in the game of survival, adaptability beats pure genius every single time. We have to talk about the buyout, because this is the definitive moment where street smarts clashed with ego and logic was entirely on the side of the dropout. After the train heist, the crew is sitting on a massive ocean of precursor. They have an opportunity to sell their share to a rival dealer for $5 million each. It is a clean exit. It is retirement money. It is the kind of victory condition that any rational criminal strives for. Mike Ehrmantraut, the veteran who has survived decades in this business, agrees that selling is the right move. Jesse Pinkman, the young man who has lost everything and been beaten down by the trade, agrees that selling is the right move. They both recognize that the risk has eclipsed the reward. They see the exit door and they are smart enough to walk through it. But Walter White refuses. He isn't operating on logic anymore. He is operating on pride. He talks about building an empire, about the potential value of the product if they cook it all themselves. He is trying to maximize a theoretical profit while ignoring the very real probability of death or imprisonment. Jesse looks at him and realizes that Walt has lost the plot. Jesse understands that $5 million in your pocket is worth infinitely more than $300 million in a grave. In that negotiation, Jesse is the only one thinking like a businessman, while Walt is thinking like a narcissist who believes he is too big to fail. This divergence in their thinking leads to one of the most uncomfortable and revealing scenes in the entire saga: the dinner at the White residence. When Jesse comes over to discuss the business, he is forced to sit through a meal with Walt and Skylar. Most people view this scene as just awkward comedy, but look at Jesse's eyes. He is analyzing the domestic reality of the great Heisenberg. Walt has spent months justifying his actions by claiming he is doing it all for his family. He uses his wife and children as a moral shield. But as Jesse sits there, watching the hostility between the couple, seeing the wine being poured with venom, and feeling the icy silence, he realizes the truth. He sees that the empire Walt is so desperate to build is a kingdom of ash. There is no love there. There is no family to save. Jesse is smart enough to see that Walt has already lost the very thing he claims to be fighting for. It is a moment of profound clarity, where Jesse realizes that, despite all the money and the power, he does not want to end up like Mr. White. This realization culminates in the desert meeting later in the season, a pivotal interaction that completely flips the power dynamic. Walt calls Jesse out to the middle of nowhere to convince him to leave town and start a new life. Walt puts on his usual performance. He adopts the persona of the caring father figure, speaking softly, telling Jesse that this is for his own good, that he deserves a fresh start. He tries to sell the idea that he is doing this out of love, not because he needs to tie up a loose end. For years, this manipulation worked. Jesse would buy into the guilt, the shame, and the false affection. But this time, Jesse stands his ground. He doesn't say a word at first, just letting Walt spin the web. And then he cuts through it. He refuses to accept the lie. He tells Walt to drop the act. He demands that for once, just once, Walt speaks to him like a man and admits that he needs Jesse gone for his own political safety. It is a breakthrough of emotional intelligence. Jesse diagnoses the situation perfectly. He knows Walt is terrified of Hank's investigation. He knows Walt is cornered. By forcing Walt to admit the transactional nature of their relationship, Jesse reclaims his agency. He stops being the victim and becomes the judge. He essentially tells the genius manipulator that his tricks don't work anymore. Walt is left stunned, dropping the mask because he realizes he can no longer outsmart the kid who used to fail his class. And we cannot overlook the way they handle the blood money. As the walls start closing in, Jesse receives his payment. To Walt, that money is a trophy. It is the score. He buries it in barrels in the desert, hoarding it like a dragon, obsessed with the legacy it represents. But Jesse looks at the cash and sees only the lives it cost. He sees the dirt on it. His decision to try and get rid of the money, tossing bundles out of his car window into neighborhoods, is often dismissed as a mental breakdown. But in a poetic sense, it is the most sanity anyone shows in the final season. Jesse identifies that the money is a poison. He understands that keeping it makes him complicit in everything that happened, including the tragedy with the boy on the bike. Walt thinks he can wash the money and make it clean for his children. Jesse is smart enough to know that you cannot launder blood. By rejecting the fortune, Jesse is trying to save his soul, while Walt is busy losing his for a pile of paper that he will never get to spend. Walt dies alone in a lab, surrounded by equipment, but isolated from humanity. Jesse's rejection of the empire mindset is ultimately what allows him to survive the moral decay that consumed everyone else. But the absolute peak of Jesse's strategic brilliance comes when he finally decides to partner with Hank. When they are trying to catch Walt, Hank suggests wearing a wire, trying to get a confession on tape. It's a standard police tactic, but Jesse knows it won't work. He knows Walt is too careful, too paranoid, and too smart to ever say the incriminating words out loud in a public place. Jesse explains to the DEA agent that a direct approach will fail. Instead, Jesse proposes a different angle. He knows the one thing Walt cares about more than his freedom, more than his family, and certainly more than his partner. He knows Walt's true weakness is his greed. Jesse formulates the plan to threaten the money. He understands that Walt is arrogant enough to believe he is the only one who knows where it is buried, but paranoid enough to panic if he thinks it is being destroyed. This is the checkmate move. The Great Heisenberg, the man who outsmarted drug lords and cartels, is baited into a trap not by a complex chemical formula, but by a picture of a barrel and a bluff. Jesse uses Walt's own psychological profile against him. He anticipates exactly how Walt will react. The panic, the reckless driving, the phone call. Jesse played the player. He forced Walt to lead them directly to the evidence, something the entire DEA had failed to do for a year. It was Jesse Pinkman, the student, who finally outsmarted the master and put him in handcuffs. If it weren't for the unpredictable arrival of Jack's gang, a variable neither of them could have accounted for in that specific moment, Jesse would have won the game right there. He had Walt dead to rights. He stripped away the genius and revealed the desperate, greedy criminal underneath. But survival isn't just about outsmarting the villain. Sometimes it's about outlasting the consequences. And in the final chapter of this breakdown, we have to look at how Jesse navigated the impossible nightmare of captivity and how he used his skills to secure the only victory that truly mattered, his freedom. We have arrived at the darkest chapter, the period where intelligence stops being about chemistry and starts being about pure, primal survival. When the dust settles in the desert and Hank is buried, Jesse is dragged away to a concrete pit. Most people would have broken immediately. They would have given up or provoked their captors into ending it. But Jesse Pinkman possesses a resilience that Walter White never had to develop. While Walt is hiding out in a cabin in New Hampshire, paying for company and stewing in his own bitterness, Jesse is essentially living through a horror movie. And in this nightmare scenario, we see a different kind of brilliance emerge. It isn't the brilliance of formulas or business strategy. It is the brilliance of observation and mechanical ingenuity. Consider the first escape attempt. Jesse is chained, beaten, and terrified. Yet he doesn't lose his head. He studies the environment. He notices the structural weakness in the containment. He realizes that the shackles aren't just restraints, they are a puzzle. Walt needs millions of dollars of equipment to solve a problem. Jesse needs a paperclip. He painstakingly picks the locks, navigating the compound with a stealth and physical awareness that Walt simply does not possess. He almost makes it. And the only reason he fails isn't because he wasn't smart enough. It is because he was outnumbered. But the attempt itself proves that even in the lowest pit of hell, Jesse's mind is active, calculating, and looking for the variables he can control. And then there is the psychological aspect of his imprisonment. We have to talk about the relationship with Todd. Todd is a psychopath, a man who kills children without blinking. Walt dismisses Todd as a useful idiot, a pawn to be moved around the board. But Jesse understands the true danger. He sees that Todd is a monster looking for a pet. Jesse plays the role he needs to play to stay alive. He cooks the meth to the highest standard, not out of pride like Walt, but because he knows his value is the only thing keeping him breathing. He makes himself indispensable. Walt thinks he is the king because he creates the blue product, but Jesse proves that the product is bigger than the man. He replicates Walt's genius perfectly, effectively rendering the Great Heisenberg obsolete. In that lab, chained to a track, Jesse proves that he learned every single lesson, stripping Walt of the one thing that made him special. This leads us to the finale, the moment the entire series has been building toward. Walt returns to Albuquerque with a master plan. He builds a remote-controlled machine gun, a device of pure destruction. It is a plan born of ego and a desire to go out in a blaze of glory. He is there to kill the gang, sure, but he is also there to settle the score, to prove he is the smartest man in the room one last time. But look at what happens when the bullets start flying. Walt tackles Jesse to the ground, saving him, yes, but also trapping him in the line of fire. When the smoke clears, Walt is wounded and the gang is dead, except for Todd. In this moment, Jesse doesn't wait for instructions. He doesn't look to Mr. White for a plan. He sees the opportunity and he takes it. He uses the very chains that enslaved him to strangle his oppressor. It is a moment of poetic, brutal justice. Walt used science to kill his enemies. Jesse used his own suffering. He turns the tools of his imprisonment into the weapons of his liberation. It is a visceral, reactive intelligence that Walt, with all his planning and plotting, could never replicate. And then comes the gun. The two men stand facing each other in the lab. Walt kicks the pistol over to Jesse. He tells him to do it. "You want this," he says. Walt is trying to manipulate Jesse one last time. He wants absolution. He wants to die by Jesse's hand, so he can feel like he paid for his sins, so he can control the narrative of his own death. He wants to turn Jesse into a murderer one last time to validate his own choices. But Jesse looks at him. He sees the wound in Walt's side. He sees the pathetic, broken man who destroyed his life. And he realizes the game. He realizes that pulling that trigger gives Walt exactly what he wants. Jesse's refusal is the smartest thing he ever does. By dropping the gun and saying, "Do it yourself," he denies Walt the satisfaction of a dramatic exit at the hands of his partner. He refuses to be Walt's tool. He refuses to be the instrument of Walt's redemption or his punishment. In that decision, Jesse Pinkman finally outgrows Walter White. He recognizes that true power isn't about violence, it is about choice. Walt has no choices left. He is a dead man walking. Jesse has the whole world. By walking away, by leaving Walt to die alone among the cold steel and chemicals, Jesse reclaims his humanity. He gets in that El Camino and he drives. And as he smashes through the gates of the compound, screaming into the night, it isn't a scream of terror. It is a scream of release. He survived the cartels. He survived the neo-Nazis. And most importantly, he survived Walter White. The genius chemist lies dead on the floor, a victim of his own ambition. The dropout speeds away into the darkness, scarred but free, headed toward a future that is entirely his own. But the story doesn't quite end there. Because escaping the cage is one thing, escaping the past is another. In the final part of this breakdown, we need to look at the aftermath and why Jesse's ability to disappear, to truly become a ghost, was the final, definitive proof that he was the only one who actually knew how to play the game. The true test of intelligence isn't just about escaping a cage. It is about staying free once the lock is broken. When Jesse speeds away from the compound, screaming in that El Camino, he isn't just running from the neo-Nazis, he is running from a nationwide manhunt. Walter White's death makes headlines, but Jesse Pinkman is the surviving face of the operation. He is the loose end that every agency in the country wants to tie up. And this is where we see the final evolution of Jesse's street smarts. Walt spent his final months in isolation, paying a fortune just to have a card game with a stranger because he had burned every single bridge he ever built. He died alone because he viewed relationships as transactions. Jesse, however, survives the immediate aftermath because he actually forged genuine bonds. When he shows up at Skinny Pete and Badger's door, he is a fugitive, a liability that could send them to prison for decades. A logical, self-preserving person would shut the door, but they take him in. They feed him, they clothe him, and they give him a plan. This isn't charity. It is the return on investment for years of Jesse treating them like human beings rather than pawns. Walt had employees. Jesse had friends. That social capital is what gets him out of the initial dragnet. Skinny Pete orchestrates the car swap, creating a decoy that sends the police chasing a ghost while Jesse slips away in a nondescript vehicle. It is a masterstroke of misdirection, executed not by high-level masterminds, but by the low-level street guys Walt always looked down upon. It proves that loyalty is a strategic asset that Heisenberg completely undervalued. But the final hurdle is the money. Jesse needs to pay the disappearer, Ed Galbraith, to vanish for good. He knows where Todd hid his cash, but arriving at the apartment, he encounters the new threat, Neil and his welding company thugs. These men represent the last vestige of the violent world Jesse is trying to escape. They are arrogant, armed, and dismissive of Jesse, seeing him as a broken rat. The confrontation at the welding shop is the ultimate thesis statement for Jesse's intelligence. Neil challenges him to a duel, a classic Wild West showdown. It is a battle of egos. Neil wants to prove he is the fastest gun. He thinks he is the alpha predator. A younger Jesse might have been intimidated or tried to run. Walter White would have tried to build a bomb or negotiate a percentage. But Jesse realizes something crucial in that moment. He realizes that fair fights are for losers. He agrees to the duel, he stands his ground, and he lets Neil bask in his own arrogance. Neil is focused entirely on the speed of the draw, fixated on the rules of the game he thinks they are playing. Jesse isn't playing a game. He is fighting for his life. He has a second gun concealed in his pocket. He doesn't try to be faster, he simply shoots through his coat before Neil can even lift his weapon. It is a dirty trick, it is underhanded, and it is absolutely brilliant. Jesse uses Neil's ego as a distraction. He exploits the expectation of a fair fight to eliminate the threat. Walt needed a trunk-mounted machine gun to kill his enemies. Jesse just needed a distraction and the will to survive. He outsmarts the gunman by refusing to respect the premise of the gunfight. With the money secured and the threats neutralized, Jesse finally faces the disappearer. This negotiation is the final exam. He doesn't demand, he doesn't threaten, and he doesn't try to manipulate Ed with lies. He lays it all on the table. He pays his dues, literally and metaphorically. He accepts that he cannot change the past, but he can purchase a future. When he arrives in Alaska, we see the starkest contrast to Walt's ending. Walt died in a meth lab, surrounded by the machinery that destroyed his family, leaving behind a legacy of ruin. He got the credit, sure. He got the fame, but he lost his soul. Jesse drives through the snow, the quiet white landscape stretching out before him. He is Mr. Driscoll now. He is a nobody. And in that silence, he finds the victory that Walt never could. Walt wanted to be the king. Jesse just wanted to be free. Throughout the entire series, we were led to believe that Walter White was the genius, the mastermind, the one who knocked. We watched him outthink drug lords and evade the DEA. But every single time he found himself in a corner, it was his ego that put him there, and often it was Jesse's intuition that offered the way out. Walt had the book smarts to build the empire, but he lacked the street smarts to keep it. He lacked the emotional intelligence to manage the people, the adaptability to survive the chaos, and the humility to walk away when he had the chance. Jesse Pinkman, the dropout, the junkie, the student, survived because he learned the one lesson Mr. White never could: knowing when to stop. In the end, the smartest man in Breaking Bad wasn't the one who died a legend, it was the one who lived to forget the name Heisenberg. If you enjoyed this breakdown of the hidden layers in the series, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We have a lot more analysis coming on the psychology of Better Call Saul and the unseen details of the criminal underworld. Check out the video on the screen right now for a deep dive into every serial killer who could have taken down Dexter. Thanks for watching.